Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most consequential economic decisions of the 21st century. And we're going to do it by telling the story of the one man who saw exactly where it was all heading and tried to stop it.
Okay, so picture this. It's 2010. You're inside the U.S. Federal Reserve, the most powerful financial institution on the planet. And one man casts these 6 votes. In a place that's built on consensus, this was basically the sound of someone pulling a fire alarm, over and over and over again.
And this is the guy who pulled it, Thomas Honig. Now, this wasn't some natural-born rebel, He was a rule follower, a Vietnam vet who worked his way up from bank examiner to become president of the Kansas City Fed. But in 2010, he found himself standing completely, utterly alone against the entire Federal Reserve System. So, why'd he do it? To really get that, we need to understand the man himself and the absolutely critical moment in history he found himself in. All through 2010, the U.S. economy was still reeling from the 2008 crash, and in Washington, total political gridlock. So the pressure on the Fed to do something was just immense. As the central bank got ready to unleash its most powerful weapons, Honig's dissent became this constant lonely drumbeat inside that boardroom.
So, what exactly was this powerful machine that Honig was trying so hard to slow down?
Okay, the Fed's main control panel is a committee called the FOMC. You can think of them like engineers in the control room of the economy's nuclear reactor. Their main job is setting interest rates. When they cut rates, it's like they're heating up the reactor to get more growth. When they raise them, they're cooling it down to prevent a meltdown, like runaway inflation. Well, here's the problem. After the 2008 crisis, the Fed had already slammed that main lever all the way down. Interest rates were basically at zero. But the economy was still incredibly fragile, unemployment was sky high, and Congress was just paralyzed. So the engineers in the control room felt like they had to do something more, something drastic. And that something was a pretty radical tool called quantitative easing, or just QE. It's basically a 3-step process to pump trillions of new dollars directly into the banking system. The Fed calls up a huge bank, offers to buy things like government bonds, and then, and this is the part that blows your mind, it literally creates the money to pay for it digitally, right out of thin air. As you can imagine, this massive, unprecedented move kicked off one of the most intense internal arguments the Fed had seen in decades. This slide really gets to the heart of the fight. On one side, you have the Fed chair, Ben Bernanke. His thinking was, look, if we pump all this money in, it'll boost asset prices, like stocks. That creates a wealth effect, people feel richer, they spend more, and that creates jobs. But Honig saw something much, much darker. He warned that all this would do is inflate dangerous speculative bubbles and set us all up for the next financial crash.
See, Honig's big fear wasn't about the simple kind of inflation you learn about in school. He was worried about this, the allocative effect. The idea that the Fed wasn't just managing the economy anymore, it was fundamentally distorting it, pushing money away from real businesses on Main Street and funneling it straight into Wall Street speculation.
I mean, central bankers just don't talk like this, right? It's not polite, it's not academic. As his frustration mounted, Honig used this incredibly blunt warning to describe a policy that he believed would have severe long-term consequences that his colleagues were just totally ignoring.
Well, spoiler alert, Honig lost the fight. The Fed went ahead with its plan, and the results, wow, they were absolutely staggering. That second round of QE, the one Honig fought so hard against back in 2010, it injected a fresh $600 billion into the financial system. And that was just the appetizer. A couple years later came a third round of QE, this time totaling a mind-boggling $1.6 trillion.
All of this led to an increase in the extra cash held by banks. That is, well, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. Compared to before the crisis, the amount of spare cash sloshing around the system shot up by 96,000%. So what do you do with all that cash when safe investments like government bonds are paying you basically nothing? You have to find a return somewhere, right? This kicked off a frantic, desperate search for yield, where investors poured this tidal wave of cash into riskier and riskier assets.
And here is where all that money went. It created a phenomenon that Wall Street started calling the everything bubble. Why? Because pretty much everything was in a bubble, from corporate debt to the stock market. From commercial real estate to risky oil ventures, prices for nearly every kind of asset were inflated by all this cheap money. just like Honig predicted.
So, this brings us to the legacy. What were the long-term consequences of making that deal with the devil? Well, Honig's prophecy came true. The everything bubble made the entire financial system addicted to cheap money and incredibly fragile. So fragile that when the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, the system was so unstable that the Fed had to intervene even bigger and faster than ever before just to stop a complete and total collapse. Honig's warning about the future was stark. He basically said, look, once you get the entire global economy hooked on 0% interest rates for a decade, you can't just flip a switch and go back to normal. Getting out, he knew, was going to be incredibly painful and destabilizing.
And that leaves us with one last, pretty provocative question from Honig himself. After a decade of a policy that, let's be honest, overwhelmingly benefited the people who own assets, the wealthiest among us, at the expense of everyday savers, did the Fed's actions actually help create the deep social and political divisions we're all living with today? It's a heck of a question to think about.